Hello and good morning. At least here in Chicago, good morning. I'm Melissa Harris, and I'm excited to be here representing MXD's National Center for Cybersecurity in Manufacturing. Today's talk with a legend in cryptography, Martin Hellman, is part of MXD's Cybersecure Supplier Program. This program helps large manufacturers build more secure and resilient supply chains. We deliver a comprehensive communications program that raises cyber awareness within a company's supply chain, helping both the big companies and the smaller ones protect their operations, revenue, and reputations. Cybersecurity is serious business, but our program also tries to make it engaging and, dare I say, fun. I think we're going to have a little bit of fun today. And so hence us extending an invitation to Stanford University's Martin Hellman. As the co-inventor of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, Martin needs no introduction to cybersecurity experts. Our partners on this program at Rolls-Royce could not believe, Martin, I'm serious, when I said that I had spoken to you one-on-one, that I knew you, they almost didn't believe me. Hellman and Diffie were awarded the Marconi Fellowship and accompanying prize in 2000 for work on public key cryptography and for helping make cryptography a legitimate area of academic research. And in 2015, they were awarded the Turing Award, often referred to as the Nobel Prize for Computing, for the same work. Martin, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and then we'll take audience questions before wrapping up about 45 minutes from now. Thanks everyone for being here, and Martin, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Melissa. And so I just have to tell you that my younger brother worked in corporate counterespionage, among other things, when he was still employed. We're retired now. And at one point, there was a guy talking with him about cryptography. And he said, but that gets too complicated. And my younger brother's pretty sharp, although his background's more in chemistry. And so he said, try me. And the guy said, nah, it's too complicated. He said, well, my brother's Marty Hellman. And the guy wouldn't believe him, even though his name is Steve Hellman. So I kind of love it. And I marvel at the fame, the niche fame that I have. So I'm glad. Thank you for that introduction. So I'm going to talk about cryptography. And first of all, let me emphasize why cryptography is needed. If we're using physical mail, even if I gave you access to the main post office in London or in Chicago or San Francisco, it wouldn't really help you very much because you'd have to steam open envelopes and read them by hand. It would be very expensive. In contrast, information in computer readable form, my last estimate was something like 10 to the 14th words for $1 can be scanned. That's 100 million words for $1. Very, very cheap. And so cryptography becomes very important. And public key cryptography becomes important because it makes cryptography much easier to use. And somebody told me about 20 years ago that public key cryptography protected trillions, that's millions of US dollars every day. And I said, you mean per year? And he said, no, I mean per day. And it turns out he's right. The last I looked, foreign exchange transactions alone, which are all protected by public key cryptography, amounted to $7.5 trillion per day, 7.5 million US dollars per day. And public key cryptography also allows secure software updates. So how does your phone know that it's Apple or Google that's updating, that's providing the software update, not some malevolent character? They use a secret key, like Apple, for example, on my iPhone, uses a secret key to sign the software update, and my phone has a public key. So even if someone takes my phone apart, they can't get the secret key needed to sign. And it's critical to blockchain technology, as many of you know. And in fact, at this time in the Q&A, we might get into what were the origins of blockchain technology. So let me see. I think now I'm going to move. Yes, now I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Go up here to share Windows. There we go. And now I'm going to go to slideshow. Play from start. Okay. So this is a picture of Whit Diffie. He's on the right in the plaid shirt. I'm in the middle. I had a beard in those days, around 1976. And the guy on the left, the tall guy, is not usually associated with this, but he should be. His name is Ralph Merkle. And I'll explain why I think if you're going to assign names to Diffie-Hellman key exchange, it should be Diffie-Hellman Merkle key exchange. But I've kind of given up on that. Ralph, unfortunately, doesn't get the credit he deserves. So how does it work? Well, here's a picture of me and Whit in better days. More recently, Whit's hair is now whiter, and we're wearing nicer clothing. And my wife Dorothy's in the middle. And we're trying to plan a surprise party for her, let's say. So I'm going to do this with messages in written form to explain the idea. So I've got a message that I lock up in a strongbox, and I put Marty's lock, ML, on it. I then hand it to Dorothy. She doesn't know my combination, so she can't open it. And she hands it to Whit. He doesn't know my combination either, so he can't open it as well. But I've made the strongbox big enough so that Whit can put a second lock on, Whit's lock, WL. Now he passes that doubly lock box to Dorothy. She can't take either lock off. When I get it, what can I do? I take off my lock, leaving only Whit's lock. I pass it back to Dorothy. She can't open it. When Whit gets it, what can he do? He can take off his lock, get the message. And
Oh my
that's
goodness.
basically how Diffie-Hellman or Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange works. And a key requirement is that commutativity is needed. Just to remind you, addition is commutative. 2 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 2. It doesn't matter which order you do it in. You get 5. Division is not commutative. And it's important that the locks could be taken off in either order. That's the commutative nature of the locks. Removing the locks would not be commutative if only one lock could fit on the box at a time. So if I designed the strongbox that way, I could have put my lock on it, Marty's lock, and then Whit, when he got it, could have put it in a bigger strongbox and added his lock. But when I got it, I couldn't get inside to get my lock off. It has to be commutative. And the discrete exponential function used in Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange is a commutative one-way function. I'm not going to go into that here, but those of you know how it works. I used y equal alpha to the x mod p as a commutative one-way function. It didn't matter which order you exponentiated, whether you first computed y1 equal alpha to the x1 and then raised that to the x2 power. You got the same result if you raised alpha to the x2 power and then raised it to the x1. You get alpha to the x1, x2 in either case. Why do I call it Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange? Well, I was trying to, Ralph Merkle was a graduate student working at Berkeley. Actually, he was an undergraduate and then a master's student working at Berkeley on his own, who came up, and you'll see, in fact, his proposal for a term project to do the privacy part of public key cryptography. And Whit and I, independently at Stanford, had come up with the concept of a public key crypto system, whereas Ralph had something called a public key distribution system. They're slightly different, and we explain this in our Whit and I in our paper, November 1976, New Directions in Cryptography. And while I was trying to find a Diffie-Hellman public key crypto system, which the RSA system is, by the way, I was surprised to find I'd come up with a Merkle public key distribution system. So what's usually called Diffie-Hellman key exchange is really a Merkle system. And here's a picture of John Gill, one of the unsung heroes of cryptography. This also was from the mid-70s. He's now about my age and much older. John Gill suggested indices when I went to him. He did his PhD in mathematics at Berkeley and then came to Stanford. He did his PhD under Manuel Blum, who some of you may know in computer science, but he did it in mathematics. And so I went to John around 73, 74 when he'd been here a year or two. And I said, John, we didn't yet have public key cryptography, but I was looking for mathematical functions with simple mathematical functions. And I asked him for the simplest cryptographic entity, which was a one-way function. And John said, what about indices, which I'd never heard of? And that's the mathematical term for discrete logarithms. And it is commutative, as I've explained. It doesn't matter whether you first compute alpha to the x1 then to the x2, or do it in reverse order, you get the same result. So here's Merkel's public key distribution proposal from the fall of 1974 in CS244 at Berkeley, before we even heard of him. And he had to propose a term project. And project number 1, you might be able to read it. The topic was establishing secure communications between separate secure sites over insecure communication lines. That's the privacy part of public key cryptography. What the professor wrote on the paper, and this was Lance Hoffman, who's now at George Washington University, project 2, which was a much more mundane project, looks more reasonable, maybe because your description of project 1 is muddled terribly. Talk to me about this today. In typical fashion, Ralph didn't go talk to Lance. He dropped the course and did this on his own. And this gave rise to what's usually called Merkel's puzzle system. Let me get rid of this. Okay, we're back to me now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, interestingly, Ralph submitted his paper to the CACM, the communications of the ACM. It was rejected. Now, so let me read what the editor wrote. I was particularly bothered by the fact that there are no references to the literature. Has anyone else ever investigated this approach? That was in her letter to Ralph. And the answer is nobody's ever investigated this approach before. It was totally new. We hadn't even come up with the idea in the fall of 74. She then included a review by an experienced cryptography expert, was her description. And he wrote, the paper is not in the mainstream of present cryptographic thinking. I would not recommend that it be published. Well, eventually, now in the editor's defense, in the reviewer's defense, Ralph didn't know how to write a paper. He should have had references. And I helped him rewrite the paper and was eventually accepted. But it came out in, I think, 1978, whereas our paper was late 1976. And it looks like his work followed ours, but it actually preceded ours by a little bit, if anything, although we worked independently initially. Well, Ralph is a good example of what I call the wisdom of foolishness. And this, I'll tell you how it started. My wife, Dorothy, who you saw a picture of before, was doing tarot readings about 35 years ago. And I said to her, Dorothy, why are you doing that? We don't believe in fortune telling, which is what I thought of the cards as doing. And she said, well, I picked up through my pores, because she didn't go to church as a child. Her mother was brought up Catholic, but she was brought up nondescript. She said, I didn't go to church as a child, but I picked up through our society that if it's not of the church, it's of the devil. And therefore, she had a fear of tarot. And I love this about her. She said, if I was going to be afraid of it, I should know what it was first. And so I bought a tarot deck and I'm doing tarot readings. Would you like me to do yours? So I said, okay, let's see what the silly cards show. And so she dealt the cards out and I ended up the fool. I was not happy. I didn't say, but I wanted to say, I'm not a fool. I'm a world famous Stanford professor. I hadn't yet won the Turing Award. I think I hadn't won the Marconi Fellowship even at that point. But all this was on the horizon. But then Dorothy showed me the positive qualities of the fool. And the key one was he goes where no one else goes. And as soon as she described that, I realized that my professional success was largely due to my willing to be a fool. And so I actually have a talk now, The Wisdom of Foolishness. And you can actually, if you do a web search on Hellman, Wisdom of Foolishness, especially if you had Stanford Engineering Hero, it'll bring up a 1-hour talk I gave to the Stanford Engineering School about 15 years ago when I was named as Stanford Engineering Hero. And it quotes 5 people, including Brad Parkinson, who was the key architect of GPS. And he said the Air Force thought GPS was crazy when he first proposed it in the late 1960s. They had good reasons. In the late 1960s, a GPS receiver cost $250,000, weighed about 150 pounds, about 70 kilos, and it used 2 kilowatts of power.
Wow.
And some other things. But what Brad wrote to me, and I got an email from him to make sure I got it right. He later won the IEEE Medal of Honor, which is the top prize at the IEEE for this. he wrote, but I could foresee the digital revolution that was underway. And now that same GPS receiver is a small fraction of a chip in this smartphone.
Hmm.
Take a quick look. Since I've won the Turing Award, I've interacted with a number of Nobel laureates, and I was honored to deliver a talk on the technological imperative for ethical evolution, which is at the 2019 annual meeting of Nobel laureates, and that's also online, and it's in my publications page, both the text version and the video if you want to watch that. But I asked 5 of the Nobel laureates at that meeting whether the work that won them their Nobel Prizes had been encouraged or discouraged initially. And 4 out of the 5 were very clearly in the foolish, crazy, never go anywhere camp. One of them, Danny Shechtman, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2011 for his work on quasi-crystals, told me that no less an authority than Linus Pauling, who won 2 Nobel Prizes, one in chemistry and one for peace, called it quasi-science. And just maybe a year and a half ago, Wu Inyaro was the Nobel speaker at the Heidelberg Laureate Forum, which I go to every year in Heidelberg, Germany. And Wu told me that the work that won him his Nobel Prize was in nitric oxide, NO. And so he's also you often call Dr. No. And he said that before his work paid off, the dean of the medical school called him in and said, Lou, we hired you because you did good work. Why are you doing this crazy stuff? Crazy stuff that won him the Nobel Prize. And so this is the wisdom of foolishness. And Ralph certainly had a good dose of that when he didn't listen to Lance Hoffman's criticism. Oh, and Vince Cerf, who many of these people will know, he's quoted in my Stanford Engineering Hero talk about 15 years ago. He said, even after the success of the ARPANET, packet switching was viewed as unacceptable, crazy for voice, much less video, because the latency was too great. And yet today we're using voice over IP. We're getting Netflix and other streaming services using internet protocol.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me turn to the first crypto war.
If I could ask you, Martin, when did the idea of the secure exchange, though, transition from crazy to, oh, this is what we should do? Was there a moment or a moment or an event or a publication that made
Good
that?
question. Jim Massey, who's now passed, Jim was a fantastic information theorist. He was the editor of the Information Theory Transactions, where Whit and I published our paper. Actually, Jim invited me to write a paper on cryptography even before we had Diffie-Hellman or Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange. We just had the idea at that point. So some people like Jim could foresee the future, but even Jim Omura, who wrote a book with Andy Viterbi, one of the founders of Qualcomm, on communication theory. Jim told me I was crazy to work in this area. And so I was at a birthday party for Tom Kylath, his 80th birthday party, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And a woman asked me what I did besides cryptography. And I told him my wife and I were working on a book about creating true love at home and peace on the planet, which you have the link for and can share with the attendees, and it has a number of these stories in it. You can search on crypto NSA. And but she was polite, but she made it clear she thought I was on a fool's errand. And I said, instead of getting mad at her, I beamed and I smiled and I said, why, thank you. That's the greatest compliment you could pay me. And Jim Omura, who had told me I was crazy to work on this in this area, was standing about 6 feet away. He was one of Tom's first PhD students, if not his first. And I said, Jim, come over here and tell this woman what you told me. And he did. Okay. So I think what really cemented it, though, was the internet in the mid-90s and the very rapid adoption of public key cryptography. So let me return to the first crypto war. This was 1976 to 1980, roughly. And NSA and I were in a fight, the National Security Agency. Loosely speaking, maybe more than loosely speaking, they and the director of NSA, Admiral Bobby Inman, wanted to throw me in jail for violating the international traffic in arms regulations. They reasoned that I was publishing my papers with wit at that point in international journals, which were being exported. So we were exporting technical data on implements of war because the ITAR defines anything cryptographic as an implement of war. And so I
Wow.
should be thrown in jail for this because the penalty was, I think, 5 or 10 years in jail, among other things. And I'll never forget when someone who worked at NSA, J.A. Meyer, I think his name was, wrote a letter to the IEEE as a member of the IEEE. And he said, I'm concerned that the IEEE is breaking the law by publishing certain papers. And he never quoted me by name, but he listed a number of issues of IEEE publications, and I had articles in all but one. And so the IEEE wrote back to Meyer at his home address, which he'd written from, saying, we're well aware of the ITAR, but it's always been our position that it's up to the authors and their institutions to make sure they're not in violation. We can't be the gatekeepers. So I took oh, by the way, the IEEE sent it to me, not as Martin Hellman troublemaker, but as Martin Hellman. I was on the board of governors of the IEEE's information theory group, which was publishing most of these papers. They didn't send it to all the board of governors. So I sometimes joke that when people start talking about cryptography, they start talking in code. Anyway, I took it to Stanford's general counsel, who told me that after reviewing it, that in his legal opinion, if the ITAR were construed broadly enough to cover my work, it was unconstitutional because it abridged freedom of speech, freedom of the press. But he also warned me, and I'll never forget this, that the only way to determine this was in a court of law. And he said, if I was prosecuted, Stanford would defend me. If I was convicted, they would appeal. But then he warned me again, if all appeals were exhausted, they couldn't go to jail for me. So I went back. He also recommended that Ralph Merkel and Steve Pollard, two students who had papers at the 1977 IEEE Symposium on Information Theory at Cornell University, that I give the papers instead of the students as planned, because the university could clearly defend me, and being a tenured professor, my career could withstand a multi-year court case if it happened. I went to the students and I told them about this. They bravely decided that they would give the papers, but then their mothers beat on them, and they came to me a week later and said, you give the papers. And so when it came time at Cornell, I invited Steve and then Ralph for each paper. And I said, normally the student would be giving the paper, but on advice of Stanford's legal counsel, I'll be giving the paper. And everyone knew what was going on. So the students got more attention that way. Oh, and I said, I want you to consider the words coming from my mouth, from the student's mouth, in all ways except legally. And so anyway, it worked out very well. Well, by 2014, Admiral Inman had changed his mind in an article which you have the link for and can share with the attendees, written by one of Dan Boneh's graduate students. So Dan largely replaced me at Stanford. Admiral Inman in this interview said, rather than being careful to make sure Diffie and Hellman weren't going to damage NSA's collection capabilities, I would have been interested in how quickly they were going to be able to make crypto systems available in a form that would protect proprietary information as well as government information. And he cited Chinese theft of American commercial secrets with strong national security implications as examples.
That's a perfect segue as we kind of talk about, many of the organizations represented on this call. You know, our partners, Boeing, Rolls-Royce, DMG Mori. We just published an article, Oshkosh. We've just published an article from Rolls-Royce where the head of product cybersecurity, Alex Hall, told me, if there is anything, let me be clear, Rolls-Royce is critical national infrastructure, yet it's a privately held and publicly traded, or it's a publicly traded company. So how was the private sector immediately interested in this technology? did you immediately begin fielding inquiries from corporations concerned about intellectual property theft, or did that
Yeah,
take even
actually,
longer?
good question. Steve Jobs was alive and in the late 70s arranged a meeting with me because Lisa, the forerunner of the Macintosh computer,
Yes,
they
his
invested
daughter.
more in the software than in the hardware, and he was concerned with how to protect it. I don't know that they ever used it, but there was
Mhm.
interest.
So that's
Um,
the first inquiry from the private sector to you on this came from Steve Jobs.
but that I remember, certainly that was the one I
Yes.
remember.
Yes.
He was an interesting
That's
character.
the
That's a
story.
whole nother story. So let me just tell one other story, and then I think I will. Let me see
We'll take questions.
how I'm doing on timing. Should have made these papers easier to.
We'll get them to everyone. Go ahead and tell one final story, and then we'll open it up for audience questions.
Okay, well, anyway, the basic point of that story about Admiral Inman is that friends are better than enemies. And the same is true of RSA, the Riveshmir and Adelman at MIT. We were good friends. Then there was a patent fight. We became enemies. And now we're friends again. And friends are better than enemies. As just two examples, Admiral Inman signed several statements of support, including one on rethinking national security that I've promulgated. And I'm not sure, but I think Ron Rivest was at least a reviewer, if not the nominator for my Turing Award. And I didn't make friends with him for that reason. In fact, I never thought of winning the Turing Award because I worked with the IEEE rather than the ACM. But friends are better than enemies. So let me just tell the story about the devil on my shoulder. Um, and this goes back to 1978, if I remember. I get a call from NSA, and it's from the director's office. And a woman tells me that Admiral Inman is going to be in California, would like to meet with me if that's possible. And I said, sure, because NSA, the joke is NSA stands for no such agency and never say anything, not the National Security Agency. So we've
Right.
been fighting a war with NSA, but it was always a shadow war. And so Inman came to my office, and there were two things I remember him telling me. First, he looks up at the top of my head and he smiles and he says, "It's nice to see you don't have horns," which is how I must have been being depicted within NSA as the devil himself. And then he said, "I have to tell you that I'm meeting with you against the advice of all the other senior people at the agency, but I don't see the harm in talking." He was willing to break out of the box. He's an out of the box thinker. Still alive, by the way, and very capable person. I really admire him. And so we became good friends. But before that, going back to 1976, um, I realized that we had a political fight on our hands. So this is actually going back earlier, not a technical fight. And so two high-level people from NSA flew out to California, and they basically told me, "What you're doing, what you're saying is going to cause grave harm to national security. Please shut up." I went home to figure out the right thing to do. And as I'm trying to figure out the right thing to do, what I call a shadow motivation, almost like a devil appeared on my shoulder. And it whispered in my ear, "Forget about what's right and wrong. You have a tiger by the tail, run with it. You'll never have more of a chance to influence society." At the time, I thought I brushed the devil off my shoulder, and I thought I made a decision logically to move forward with what I was doing. But 5 years later, I'm watching a video called The Day After Trinity, which is about the day after the first atomic test at Trinity site in New Mexico. And all of the, about 4 or 5 of the Manhattan Project scientists are asked, "Why did you work on this horrible weapon of mass destruction that killed at least 100,000, maybe 200,000 people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki?" And they all get excited. Robert Wilson, in fact, I remember, it's almost like he's going back to Los Alamos and being a 20-something-year-old fighting the Nazis. And he said, "It would be 1,000 years of dark ages if the Nazis got the bomb before us." And fission had been discovered in Germany. Later in The Day After Trinity, they ask each of these same scientists whether when Germany was defeated in May 1945, they stopped working, or why did they continue working? And they don't know. I think I have a quote here. Let me see. Uh, Robert Wilson basically said, with everything in the day after Trinity, with everything I believed before, during, and after the war, I don't know why I didn't stop working. And he even develops a nervous tick. And watching them, I think, I can't be sure, but I think I knew why they continued working. They had the socially acceptable motivations for working on the bomb, which they had already expressed Nazi Germany. They also had socially unacceptable motivations, shadow motivations, I call them, just like the devil on my shoulder. I was
Yeah.
fortunate that I actually came to consciousness. And I realized what most people do is they figure out what they want to do, and then they come up with the rationalizations for doing it rather than figuring out what's right and doing it whether they want to or not. And I fault myself this way. It's not that I hold them uniquely guilty of this. And I vowed never to do that again, but that wasn't as easy as it seemed. And there's a story in the book with RSA where I had, and Lou Morris telling me that we'll get those RSA bastards by the balls when we were not friends with them, which I'll leave out. That was his exact quote.
Well, I'm going to kick us off with a question, and then folks,
Sure,
please
let's
put
do
your
that.
let's please put in the Q&A. Sean, is that where everybody should go in the Q&A? Yes, Scott, thank you. Please feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A. So you have the technology or the idea that you guys invented is the S in HTTPS, correct? I mean, I'm a
Correct.
novice.
Yes.
I'm not an
Whenever you
expert.
get the lock on your right.
Yeah, it is the HTTPS. It's that lock. It's the thing that says secure. But, and again, I'm speaking as a layperson. Everything I've read is that AI has the power to essentially uh, unlock these keys somehow. What is the threat, or is there a threat from AI to secure communications over the internet?
No, AI is
No.
simple. No, it's quantum cryptography. It's quantum computers that are the threat. But there, I was just talking to a friend of mine who is very expert in this area
Yeah.
yesterday. And what he said is if someone predicts 15 years, there will be quantum computer that can break factor numbers bigger than we can factor on a conventional computer. He's going to give them 5-1 odds that they're wrong. And he doesn't make bets unless they're in his favor. But he said 30 years, he'd question. Uh,
Okay.
Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about quantum computing because there's something called harvest now, decrypt later, where you scoop up large amounts of information, store it, and then
Oh,
decrypt it 30 years later. Your medical
oh,
record should still be secret 30 years from now.
wow. Okay. So the idea is it's the speed of those quantum computers, the speed at which they can essentially plow through millions of random pieces of, random information to get the key.
Well, no,
And
by
the
the way,
idea,
nobody knows whether a quantum computer can be built that will be able to do this, but there's concern that it might happen. And so
that it
we
might
need to be planning for it. And that's why NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States, has a post-quantum effort to develop public key crypto systems that could resist quantum computers.
wow. Um, okay. Uh, I'm going to continue on with some additional questions. So the internet, the S is secure for at least another 15 to 30 years. Where do you see um, the greatest needs for greater security, in like the cyber realm? What do you think we're not paying attention to, or we're not investing enough in right now?
Two things. First of all, I joke that my banks are training me to fall for phishing expeditions. How often do you get an email from your bank saying, click here to see your statement? They shouldn't be doing that. I always go to a bookmark for that bank, that
Right.
financial institution. Um,
We advise people to do that, by the way, through this program. We talk about that you don't open
Great.
the email, go to the web, go to the actual website, right? Don't open the email, go to your actual account. So that's great advice.
Actually, I think I'll stop there because I forget what my second point was.
Okay, so we recently had at a conference at Rolls-Royce in Derby a talk from Lucas Kello at Oxford, and he's a political scientist who focuses on cybersecurity. And he introduced this concept of unpiece. The idea basically is you cyber attacks, state-sponsored cyber attacks are happening on a every second. And that means that peace is no longer true in any context. That no, we are not, there is never a time where the United States is at peace. At the same time, these attacks can't be deemed as warlike. Like we can't also deem them an act of war. So the idea is that the new reality is that we are not in a state of war. We are not in a state of peace. We are now permanently and forever in something in between. What are your thoughts on that concept first? And then I think my follow-up would be, when does a cyber attack in your mind, when would a cyber attack, equate to an act of war?
Yeah, this actually reminded me of my second answer to your
Oh, okay.
earlier question, which was the North Korean attack on Sony, I think 10 years ago, roughly,
Yes.
shows that even a major Western corporation cannot resist a dedicated cyber attack by a dedicated country, no matter how small, no matter how backward it is. And so we need better cooperation. We need to cooperate with the Russians. We need to cooperate with the Chinese, which sounds impossible and is impossible in the current environment. But we need to build a more cooperative environment. And not only from a cyber point of view, there are many technological pushes. This is why I called my talk to the Nobels 6 years ago, the technological imperative, the technological requirement for ethical evolution. And we are making progress. But there's no way, the first technological breakthrough was nuclear weapons. And it's still a major risk. I estimated 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago now, that the risk of a major nuclear war was about order of magnitude 1% a year. Worse than even odds over the lifetime of a child born today. And this was before Ukraine, before Gaza. And Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, who has a PhD in mathematics, told me several months later, again before the war in Ukraine, that he agreed with me and I could quote him on that. So we need to be developing a more cooperative world, and we can't just jump there. No country can do that by itself, but we need to be figuring out how to move there. And the good news is we're making a lot of mistakes. Why do I say that's the good news? That's because there's a story in our book where 35 years ago, Dorothy and I had a huge fight, which we don't have anymore, by the way. We haven't had a fight in 20 years, which was beyond my comprehension. And I give her full credit for that inconceivable change. But we'd had a huge fight 35 years ago. And I went into the living room and I was licking my wounds. And I thought, it's all this crazy woman's fault. And then I realized, I made enough progress that I realized if I was right, I had to wait for that crazy woman to come to her senses, which might never happen, before I could get out of the pain I was in. I was powerless. With that motivation, I found what I had done to help start the fight. I went and apologized to Dorothy for that. No ifs, ands, and buts, which would have totally negated the apology, and the whole thing just evaporated. And when I gave a talk at Georgetown University, which is a Catholic university, and I'm Jewish, I felt I could quote the Gospels. So I quoted from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus said, "Why do you worry about the splinter in your neighbor's eye when you've got a 2x4 in your own?" He didn't of course, say 2x4, but a big piece of wood. Now, I'd just been talking about Ukraine, and so I said that given that our neighbor in Ukraine is Putin, he probably has a 4x8 in his eye, an even bigger piece of wood. But the admonition still applies, which leads to the question, what 2x4 do we have in our eye? And there, I'll just quote from a poll done by the University of Chicago, funded by the Wall Street Journal, on their website, but never reported on by the Wall Street Journal, that I saw 4 months after the invasion of Ukraine, in which 80%, 78%, I think, 85% of Ukrainians blame Russia for the war. But 70% also held their own government responsible, and 58% said that about us. They didn't ask them why they said that. Having studied this, I can see some reasons why they probably thought that. But that's part of the 2x4 we have in our eye that we don't even realize is there.
What kind of cyber attack what kind of cyber attack do you think does rise to the level of What kind of scenarios do
Good
you
question.
see?
Yeah. It's hard to say, but it's something, we're on a slippery slope where right now we feel we can do cyber attacks. The Russians feel they can do cyber attacks with
Right,
no consequences. But
right.
you look at the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted to teeter on the nuclear abyss, and yet they both found themselves there. So, in the same way, if we push Russia too far, or if they push us too far, we're going to find, whether it's cyber or something else, that we're suddenly on the edge of the nuclear abyss again. And if we teeter there often enough, eventually we'll fall in, which is why the 1% per year figure comes up.
So you're most known for, and I want to make sure anyone in the audience has any questions, feel free to jump into the chat. You're most known, we have just, this will probably be we'll do two more questions. This one, you're most known for this public, key system, correct? But I don't think that that was the only reason that the NSA was angry at you. Is
Oh,
is is or concerned about what you were writing about. Um, can you just talk a little bit about, where, what other aspects other than secure communication
sure.
over the internet is like you think the most important?
Well, no, actually, the first thing that got NSA pissed off at me was the DES, the data encryption standard, which some of the attendees may remember from prior to 2000. This was promulgated in 1975 as a proposed standard. Whit and I actually were naive enough to think it was a proposed standard. We looked at it, it had a 56-bit key size, which order of magnitude is 10 to the 17th keys. That's 100,000 million keys. We then calculated that if you built a special purpose chip to do 1 million searches per second, which we estimated you could do, and you bought
Yep.
1 million of these chips, you're searching 1 million keys per second across the million chips. It only takes 100,000 seconds to search 100,000 million keys. That's about a day. So we thought NBS, the National Bureau of Standards, as it was then called, would
Yep.
increase the key size because it was cheap and easy. They didn't. And we then realized that what we saw as a bug was a feature from NSA's perspective. They could break it, but no one else could. And
Oh,
this led to the first crypto war in many ways, and much more than public key cryptography.
let me make sure I understand. Let me make sure I understand that. What you're saying is that the NSA was intentionally setting weak cryptography standards for the industry so that they had the power to break it, but no one else could.
Almost weak from their point of view, strong from everyone else's point of view. If you're going to build a machine like this, you have to keep it fully loaded to realize the economy of scale. Who has a problem a day or more than a problem a day? NSA. Who doesn't? Rolls Royce.
Right. Okay. Okay. Any final thoughts? A final question. Any final thoughts on where where cybersecurity needs to go next, other than what it seems to be is ever increased vigilance and fear? Is there anything? And I know where you think the world needs to go, which is greater cooperation. But where do you think companies need to go when it comes to kind of investing in this kind of technology?
I think we need, it's going to be very tricky, but I was on a National Research Council, National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine study on cryptography in the mid 90s. And we actually argued that only NSA had the capabilities. The FBI is really, maybe it's changed, but was woefully inadequate to the requirements. And yet there was a prohibition against NSA helping with domestic security. And so
Oh,
something like that is needed. But we do need more cooperation as well. But in the interim, we also need the expertise of someplace like NSA in the commercial sector.
sector. Wonderful. Okay, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you to wrap us up. Thank you so much, Martin. I learned a lot. And Scott, can you just close us out, please? This is Scott Cruz from MXT.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Melissa. I just wanted to kind of hop on and say thanks to everybody for dialing in, kind of on behalf of MXD, the National Center for Cybersecurity and Manufacturing, and the Digital Manufacturing Institute. Just one quick shout out to all the ways to get in touch with MXD on topics of cybersecurity and manufacturing, cybersecurity generally, then everything we do in digital manufacturing. So please, if you found this at all interesting, if you're interested in just connecting with more cybersecurity resources, get in touch with us. We'll be glad to make sure that we can interact with you, give you the resources you're looking for, and stay tuned for more cool opportunities like this to learn from some of the great thinkers and minds in cryptography and cybersecurity. So I appreciate your time, Martin. Appreciate you, Melissa, for putting this together and helping us run this with Martin. Thanks everybody, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Have a
thank
great
you
one.
all.
Bye.